Hi, this is Scott with Spectre Gear for today's video. It's once again Wednesday. That means it's Wheelgun Wednesday, and I get to do one of my favorite things, and that's talk about revolvers. Now, for today's video, this is not going to be a review. It's not going to be a speed loader destruction test. We're not going to talk about any, tips, tactics, or techniques, but rather I want to do something just for the fun of doing it, and that's present a little bit of speed loader history that you might find interesting. Now, when it comes to the concept of speed loaders for revolvers, that's not a new idea. It's not even an invention of the 20th century. The first speed loader patent was issued, I believe, in 1879, and it was a device for speed loading revolvers. And leading up to the turn of the century and then into the first portion of the century leading to World War I, there were a number of companies that came out with designs to be able to effectively speed load a revolver. Now they had varying degrees of success. The only one that really exists to this day is the moon clip. Now the full moon clips that we are all familiar with for 45 ACP revolvers, that was an invention of World War I. And that's because there was a shortage of 1911 pistols, and they pressed Smith & Wesson in-frame revolvers into service, and they had to come up with some means of being able to accommodate the 45 ACP rimless cartridge, so they had to have some kind of clip on there. I don't know if they developed the 45 auto rim at that time or not, or if that was later. It may have been. But they had a couple of different clip designs. They had a 2 and a 3 round clip that I'm aware of. And with that, you could kind of more efficiently load rounds into the cylinder. The full moon clip, of course, was a much later design that was kind of mainly intended for competition purposes, but it was an invention that occurred much, much later down the road. But as far as any further development, it wasn't until the 1960s that there was any kind of commercial development of speed loaders, and none of these really saw widespread adoption. Safariland, who is responsible for the excellent Comp 1, Comp 2, and Comp 3 loaders, they had a very early design in the 1960s that basically just consisted of a rubber cup that held the 6 rounds, and you would load them in and sort of peel off. And there's some people that to this day are still trying to push that design forward. It wasn't particularly good on any level. There was another company that came out with something that does sort of resemble the speed loaders that we're talking about here, but it had a deficiency of having a very, very teeny tiny mushy release button that was hard to hit. But it wasn't until 1970 that the first commercially successful speed loader design came out, and one that saw kind of widespread adoption. And that, of course, is the Dade Loader, D-A-D-E, and it's manufactured by a company called Dade Screw Products out of Miami, Florida. And this was invented in 1970 and pushed out onto the market at that time. Now, it was the first speed loader that I ever saw, but I didn't see this speed loader being used by an actual law enforcement officer. Actually, where I saw the speed loader was in a movie. Now, up to that point, I was very familiar with law enforcement equipment because my dad was a reserve deputy with the sheriff's department throughout the 1960s and 1970s. And when he would, have his duty gear on, or he'd have guys coming around the house, other deputies coming around the house, the one thing I noted was that they all used shell loops to carry their spare ammunition, and that was something I used to be fascinated with as a very, very young boy. But then in 1973, I was taken to the movies to see what would later turn out to be my favorite Dirty Harry movie of all, and that is Magnum Force. And in that movie, there's a very notable, actually several very notable usages of speed loaders in the movie. Now, to this day, there really aren't that many movies where they feature speed loading of revolvers. And to this day, probably the best sequence in which a speed loader is used in a movie is from Magnum Force. And I refer, of course, to a couple of different range videos. Of course, there's the one where he's shooting at the underground range, and we get the controversy that exists to this day about the light special load. I'll leave that for another video. But the Hogan's Alley sequence is particularly interesting because you actually see some pretty close-up usage of this particular loader. So Dirty Harry, of course, well, not Dirty, Harry Callahan, how about that? So Harry Callahan, of course, is seen using a Dade Loader for his Model 29 during that sequence. But the one that you can really see a pretty good close-up shot of is when David Soul is reloading his Colt Python, and he uses a Dade Loader. What's interesting is he doesn't use the hand transfer technique, but rather he uses the strong-handed technique in which he drops the loader in, and then he uses the palm of his hand to release the rounds into the cylinder. And then and he closes the cylinder up and then proceeds to fire. And I thought that was pretty darn cool. And then, of course, later in the movie, when Lieutenant Briggs has Harry at gunpoint in the car, and gets his gun and then gets a speed loader, you see Harry take out a Dade Loader with some of those light specials in it, and give that to him. So, again, even as a young man, I thought that was pretty interesting, and I've always been fascinated with guns and technology for guns anyway. So it really perked me up. Now, fast forward a few years, and I start carrying guns myself, and I encountered a few older deputies that still use these all the way up into the early 1980s. Of course, after a while, pretty much everybody again adopted either a Safariland Comp 1, Comp 2, or an HKS type loader, because they are admittedly better in some ways, particularly in terms of retention of rounds. But I remained fascinated with these for years afterwards, and I was able at one point to actually find some of these. They were selling off some new old stock because this company has been out of business for a while, and I was able to obtain a bunch of these, and I've used them. I've used them on the range, and they are, as a straight up like competition loader, they are slick. Really, really nice. Their only big downfall is that they don't retain their rounds very well at all. So let me show you how these work, by the way. So you saw me do the load there. So, we've got sort of that traditional shape and profile of the speed loader that we're used to. The retention mechanism, though, is going to be this spring that fits in this groove right here. And loading them is just a snap. Now, the quick way of doing it is just to drop all 6 rounds in. Now, you could do this individually with each round, but the quickest way is just load all 6 in, and then take the palm of your hand and just press down, and they lock into place. So when you press down, what happens is the rim of the cartridge gets captured by that spring, and you're good to go. The rounds are held pretty well in terms of indexing. You saw how easily that just dropped into place, just like that. It's not terribly larger than most of the speed loaders out there. Now, I know that some of the early combat Magnum grips, for instance, there were troubles clearing this loader, and you would have to relieve them with some sandpaper or a rasp and kind of hollow that out. But newer grip designs accommodate this quite well. It doesn't really get in the way of anything. And of course, the release is just simply pressing this very large knob right here. Now, like I said, David Soul used the palm of his hand. You could use your thumb is another mechanism, or you just simply press down. But all you simply do is just press, and these little pedals right here that come off of that knob, they just push the rounds out from under that spring tension. So you press just like so, and they all just release right in. Smooth as that. Pretty cool. Now, the downsides to this. As easy as this is to load, it is just as easy to unload outside of the gun. And that's why these aren't particularly good for pocket carry. If you carry these, they have to be in a fairly well reinforced pouch, and it has to be protected from any activation of that knob, because within the pouch or within a pocket, if you press that knob, the rounds release. So if you happen to drop the speed loader and it lands knob down, chances are the rounds are gonna jet out of there pretty easily. And like I said, for pocket carry, again, same problem. So you would definitely, like I said, need to carry this in some kind of well-protected pouch. But it's, as I said, it's a really cool little design. Now there is a company that's sort of taken this and run with it. I think it's called Speed Bees or Speedy Bees. I know they make a lot of loaders for 22 long rifle, and they utilize pretty much the same design of the retention spring. I don't know if they make any loaders for the larger caliber rounds. I might actually look into that just to see if they've improved the retention portion of this. But if you get a chance to grab some of these, and if you search eBay, you can find these. They're rare, but they're not super duper rare. But they're an interesting piece of history. But also from a pure competition angle, they're actually pretty slick loaders. They're nice and fast, particularly if you're a big fan, which I'm not, by the way, but I won't criticize you if you are. But there is the strong hand reloading technique where you just the gun never leaves your firing hand, and then you just, as I said, you just drop those in and let her go. If you're a person who does that, these might interest you, or a design based off of these might interest you. You just have to take into account the possibility if these will release the rounds. But I myself prefer just to kind of keep these in the shape they're in as sort of a cherished piece of firearms history, and something that I found interesting as a 10-year-old boy, and I find just as interesting now, all these years later. It's pretty neat. So I thought you might find that interesting. So with that, I will thank you for watching and or listening. This is Scott from Spectre Gear. Have a wonderful day.